So as we get started with our new series, a little bit of a house cleaning thing. First of all, we've been taking communion every week, and that's a practice we hope to continue. And so if today's message or any message throughout this series really churns up something that you want to pray about, we just want you to feel welcome to hang around after church and not feel like you have to hurry out. We'll have communion so folks can come forward and receive communion, and then after the communion stations, we'll have our prayer team right up front to my left. And my encouragement for you would just be to not leave unless, if you really feel like God is calling you to pray with someone. Whether that's, hey, I want to just talk about my faith. I want to accept Christ. I want to just pray about something in my life. I just want you to know off the bat that ministry will be there after our message, after our service. And then also these messages, as we put in the bulletin, are guaranteed to be appropriate for 6th grade and up. Anything below that is kind of parents' decision, parents' discretion. I'd certainly be okay with my kids being in here, but it would also probably give us some things to talk about after church. So underneath 5th grade, that's kind of your call as a parent. We won't go into anything grotesque or obviously disturbing, but that's kind of just something we wanted to share as well. As we get started here, I'd just love to open with a word of prayer and ask God to bless our time of His Word. Lord Jesus, thank you so much for the gifts you've given us, including the gift of sex. As we talk about your vision for the world and for this instrument in your hand, we pray that you would open our hearts to be receptive to the vision you have for us, and also to the joy that you intend for us to live in as your creatures, so that we would reject anything that takes away from that joy and causes pain. We also pray that you would create us evermore as people who don't argue about important topics like this, but who lovingly and openly and welcomely just speak with love and pray for our fellow neighbors, listen without judgment, and then as opportunities arise, to share from our hearts. God, we give this time to you and we trust that you have a lot for us today. In Jesus' name, amen. It was like a pea green motorcycle with, all I remember, because I was young, it had the word Kawasaki in silver letters kind of popping out the side. My dad rode it whenever he was doing errands around. We had a couple farms that he checked cows on and fed cows on, and it was his errand motorcycle. And this motorcycle, I was pretty impressed because he also used it to check cows in our pasture. We had like a 400-acre wooded pasture, and he would just buzz all around this pasture and check our cows. In the summertime, cows needed to be checked on as they roamed kind of freely because, if one were sick or one were having a baby or one were, not doing well or stuck in barbed wire, you kind of have to be aware of it to help them. So he would routinely drive around, and he would often ask us to jump on the motorcycle, which was fine and good as long as you kept your foot off the muffler. I learned that quickly, that you can really melt skin fast on a motorcycle muffler. So my brother and I would oftentimes sit one in front and one behind, and we'd jump on the motorcycle, go through the gate, shut the gate, drive through the cow yard, and then drive into the pasture. And cows, how many of you grew up with cows around you? Other than having a nice alarm clock every morning with a deep beller, cows are really interesting in terms of how they make paths. They make these well-worn paths that are about 3 to 4 inches deep. And those well-worn paths pack the dirt down, so that's actually great for riding a motorcycle. And so we would follow these cow trails all the way throughout our pasture and up and down hills through trees, and they would just blaze a trail for the motorcycle. It's almost like they tried to do that for us. They were such great motorcycle paths. And my brother and I, on a particular day, were riding with Dad, and we came over a hill, and I remember it pristinely. It was just a clear memory in my mind. Over a hill, down into kind of a clearing, a meadow, where the trees opened up, and all we saw were these berry bushes kind of coloring bright red all around us as we drove through. And in the middle of that clearing, in the middle of the grass, there were a couple cows, and my brother and I each instantly noticed, pointed our finger, and started laughing and saying, "Dad, those cows are giving each other piggyback rides." And my dad kind of looked up, slowed the bike down, turned the engine off, and kicked out the kickstand. Took a deep breath. Kind of a, this is going to happen kind of breath. And then he put me in his lap and turned around and looked at my brother. I would say I was kind of 8 and he was 9 or 10, somewhere in there, I would say. So probably not that old. And he started talking about what was happening with those two cattle. And he used words that I had never heard before, that I didn't understand, and I probably didn't even want to know at that point. He used every word from A to zygote. And I was listening. Did you like that? Did you like that? And I was listening, my brother was listening, and my dad, I could just see the sincerity in his face, in his hand gestures, in his voice. And then he translated it into people. And he talked about, well, those cows are actually, there's something similar there about how people, that whole when a man and a woman love each other thing. And my brother and I started kind of squinting our brows and looking back at the cows and looking back at Dad. And 5 or 10 minutes later, he finished up. And kind of after a long, hard day of work, he just kind of sighed, like, got that taken care of. My brother and I just contemplated for a moment what we just heard. We looked at the cows. We looked at each other. We looked at Dad. And we looked back at each other. And we smiled. And our next words were, "Yeah, right, Dad. We don't buy that story for a minute." And so my brother and I are laughing and teasing Dad for making up this stupid story about why cows give piggyback rides. They're giving a piggyback ride, Dad. Get over it. My dad hung his head. His shoulders came forward, realizing that it was a colossal waste of time. Set the alarm for 10 years where we'd probably talk about it again, turned the bike on, and rode off into the sunset. Sometimes we can miss the truth, even if it's the truth, when it's right in front of us. It can be because, like me, you're just not ready for it. It can be that you're just not able to process it and hear it, maybe because you've heard so many different versions of the truth, or you're just surrounded with a kind of a different climate of values and thinking. And it can be just because you're not willing to hear the truth. In my case, I wasn't able. Every time, as we start this new series, every time we talk about sex, and every time I've had this in the past in the church, I get some phone calls or some messages online. It never fails. Two kinds. The first kind, and as I share with my team, it happened this week where I just get some angry messages. People just angry. I don't know if I'd say hateful, but close. Kind of don't you dare talk about this. Sure that whatever we're going to say is going to be hateful and judgmental. It's going to be aimed to suppress people or twist people into something that they're not, deceive people. So I received a number of those messages this week from people who, after we released our trailer video that you just saw, Facebook said it was viewed about 4,000 times in 2 days. And so there was an immediate reaction of anger from a few, many affirming, of course. The other messages and that call that I get is probably even a little bit more disturbing. Sometimes I'll get a call from a mom or a dad who will say, excuse me, I do not want my 14-year-old to know about sex. And I usually reply, shouldn't this be a place where they do hear about it? See, the mindset is the church is like a fortress from an evil, cold, dark world, a harsh world. And the church should be the one place where we don't get inundated with these messages that we get out there. So can't the church kind of be a safe haven from all that? And a place where we don't talk about sex or suicide or issues that cause conflict and pain outside. Can this be the one safe haven? I get those messages too. And all I can say is I just think that God cares about us too much not to talk about this, because he does all the time. And I think the church has to be the one place in a culture that loves fighting about serious issues. The church needs to be the one place where we actually talk about it. You know? Sure, I'll take that. I mean, the church needs to be the one place where it's okay to do something besides argue or ignore important issues. The church needs to be the one place where I shouldn't have to be afraid to simply open up the Bible and say, look, this may or may not be anywhere near where you're at, whether your belief system or your lifestyle or just kind of your values of how you were raised or where you're at now, and that's cool. But we at least have to be a place where it's okay to listen to what God says, and where it's okay to let people sit down and say, well, here's where I'm at. Here's what I'm struggling with. Here's what I'm dealing with. Can you pray for me? Can I ask a question? And at the very least, I know some talk to me about like things like Rising Hope Coffee and sex trafficking. They say, are you sure you want to talk about that? Because many churches won't. And I'm dumb enough to not understand why. Issues that are that serious, I don't understand why. So surprise, just to be honest, is always going to be a place where we talk about things that are very biblical, very much discussed throughout God's Word, and also very serious issues in our life and day, because otherwise church just becomes irrelevant, right? And I don't want to waste your time on Sundays. I don't want to waste your family's time to be a part of a community that doesn't at least try to connect to the truth that God has for us. So I don't want to overdo things. I don't want to inundate you with images or words that just aren't helpful, but I do believe that God wants us to spend some time talking about important things like this. So with that in mind, thank you, yeah. So with that in mind, I just want to also say that this series is not aimed at any person or group, okay? There's no ulterior motive. There is no political motive. There is no kind of a hidden desire to offend or guilt or blame or single out any person or any group, whether we're talking about a young or old, couples living together, people sleeping together, in or outside of marriage, homosexuals, heterosexuals, young marrieds, older marrieds, singles. There is no intent in this series. If you really got behind closed doors and no one was listening, I wouldn't say, okay, here's really why we're doing this. This is simply a series that's aimed to engage three cultural issues, I would say. And this series is purely motivated to engage three issues in our culture that I believe cause a lot of chaos and confusion related to sexuality. So this introductory message is simply aimed to kind of lay out, okay, this is why we're doing this. There's three issues in our culture that prompt us to want to spend some time on this issue, okay? So I'm just going to talk through those issues today, call that an introduction, and then we'll dive into the three specific lies next week. First issue in our culture that we're engaging is silence. Kind of just touched on it now. If you're tracking along in your sermon notes in the back of your insert, that's point one. Our culture, I think, is very silent about this issue. Oftentimes I'll have a group of students in a room. I like to grab juniors and seniors because they've been around the block a few times more than younger students and probably just picked up more things, heard more things, and have a pretty good cultural antenna. And I'll ask them this. I'll say, okay, how many of you this year, the last 365 and a quarter, if you count leap year, days of your life, how many of you have had a good, wisdom-focused, serious talk about sexuality with someone besides your biology or health teacher? And there usually isn't a hand that goes up. And then I'll say, okay, how many of you have either personally joked or heard someone joke about sex this week? Every hand goes up. And I think that's really telling. Because we live in a culture where it's easier to joke about sex than talk seriously about it. Now, I'm all for a good joke. Don't get me wrong, okay? Some of them can be good and darn funny. But if all we can do is joke about something this important, we're missing something. Imagine a kid raised in a culture that doesn't speak wisely about sex, or a family that doesn't feel comfortable speaking wisely about sex. Imagine being raised in a family where you can't talk seriously about money or education or drugs. How are those kids going to turn out or be raised? Where it's just not safe to talk about it. It's a terrible way to grow up. A terrible way to be raised. It's a terrible way to assemble your value system. And you can't take serious things seriously. That's not a good place to be. So the first book in the Bible says something about silence. We spent some time in this passage during our relationship series a month or two ago. Genesis 2, God gives Adam a rule. Now, I would love to live in a day where I just have one rule to follow, you know? I got a parking ticket, my second parking ticket for parking downtown. I got my first ticket for parking next to kind of Fire Flower Peacock there, to working during the day, coffee shop thing, and you can't go more than 90 minutes. Did you know this? You can't park there for 90 minutes? I know it's on the sign, and I should have read the sign. So this time I drive an hour and 25 minutes after I park, I go back and I park a block away. I got an even bigger ticket this time. Because you're supposed to get off the whole street entirely and find a whole other block to park at. I don't quite understand the rules yet. But when Adam was made, God says, okay, this is a guy, and guys need to be simple. So he gives him one rule. One. At this time, there aren't even 10 commandments, just one. Here's what he says. And the Lord God commanded the man, you may eat freely of every tree in the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall die. And of course, he meant something bigger than just drop-dead death. He meant kind of a bigger spiritual death of a relationship with God that is now severed when this boundary is crossed. So Adam is, at this point, the only person on the planet. He's the only person made. He's the only person in existence. And then Genesis 2 says God made Eve. And the presumption we have is that Adam's job is to pass this message to Eve. You've got one rule, very simple responsibility, convey the rule to your wife, which we assume he does from how Eve speaks in the passage we're going to look at later. But Adam kind of seems to be the caretaker of this rule, the caretaker of this boundary that God provides for how to live and how kind of where to not step past. So we get to Genesis 3. Genesis 3 is kind of the story of the fall. The story where that one boundary that God provides is crossed or transgressed. And watch how this happens. Watch this now. The serpent, who many believe the serpent symbolizes the devil. It doesn't directly say Satan here, but I think it's probably a good presumption. You could get fat books that kind of discuss it and stuff like that, but I think we're probably talking about the devil, I think. Genesis 3. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, did God say, you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? Now, so what he's doing here, what Satan or the snake is doing, is trying to confuse Eve. He's trying to say, look, I'm not going to go right to the one that God gave the rule to. I'm going to kind of take a side angle and go to the second-hand person and just say, did he say you can't eat any trees? I don't know if he's trying to make God sound mean or just poke a hole in kind of her remembrance of what God did say. Verse 2. Now, here's where we expect Adam to respond. Here's where we expect Adam to say, actually, I got this, Eve. I'm the one he gave the rule to. So look at Adam respond. Wait a minute. Adam keeps silent. Adam doesn't say a thing. Well, maybe he's just letting Eve talk just to kind of see how she does, see how his wife has kind of heard and developed an understanding of the rule God gave to him. So maybe that's what he's doing. So the woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die. But the serpent said to the woman, you will not die. So now he's kind of directly contradicting what God has told Adam and what Adam told Eve. He's basically saying that is not true. God is actually trying to limit you. He is not caring for you from this rule. He's trying to limit you. So look what he says. You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good from evil. So the serpent contradicts the boundary God gave the woman and the man and says, actually, if you cross this boundary, you will be more like God. That's fairly tempting. I mean, that's pretty a good approach. And I'm positive that at this point, Adam is going to put his foot down, right? I mean, Adam is going to say, enough. I was there when God said what he said, and I trust him, and I trust that his rules are for our benefit, not his. He's not protecting himself from us. Go slither away. And at this point, you expect Adam to maybe even crush his heel down on the serpent's head, huh? Well, verse 3. Absolute silence. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and the tree was desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And at this point, you would think Adam would absolutely lose it, right? He's going to grab the apple, the fruit, away from Eve, and then choke, do the Heimlich thing to get the stuff out of her stomach, right? Here he comes. And she also gave some to her husband, who was with her. he ate. He doesn't say a word. Come on. What kind of man is this? Maybe he's more familiar to us than we want to let on. I don't know a man who's not tempted to be silent when their charge is to speak. I don't know a man who's not had to struggle with the question of, God has charged me to be this kind of man, and I've fallen short. I've not spoken when I should, or maybe I've spoken when I shouldn't. He says nothing. And then we see the consequence starting to happen. It spirals out of control in a way that we won't have time to get into today, but just look at the first consequence that we see for their silence. Look at verse 7. So then, the moment they swallow the pink lady apple or whatever kind of what fruit it was, then the eyes of them both were opened, and here's what they got. Here's the added bonus knowledge that they got, and they knew that they were naked. In other words, they felt ashamed of their bodies. And they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloth for themselves. They make little leaf bikinis to cover up the parts that prior to that moment they weren't ashamed of. Google has actually tracked searches. Of course, they're very good at that. The number one complaint search for men is having to do with their sexual organ. Just insecurity about it. Is it good enough? Or are there products that will help? It's more than their heart, their kidneys, their lungs. Since we turned away from God, there is shame about our bodies. Google talks about the majority of women's search are related to the shape of their bodies, related to the shame that they feel about the shape of their bodies. From a moment in this powerful story, this image that God gives us of how he made us, the moment we turned away, we experience a shame that we can see that's alive and well in our culture. Rising Hope Coffee is a great partnership for us this month, and I love the quote that is on that announcement slide from William Wilberforce, who helped to almost single-handedly eliminate slavery in England in the days of the 1800s, where he fought through the government there. And I thought that fits pretty well. Silence can be very deadly. Silence can really cause pain and problems. Silence can sometimes cripple people or families or systems or nations when simply an honestly spoken word of care and concern could transform things. Silence leads to shame. Silence leads to pain. So the first issue that we're trying to engage here is this issue of silence, where we are pressed toward a place where we don't talk about this, either because the church shouldn't be a place where we do, or because our culture is a culture where you either joke or argue about sex, but you don't actually have a context to lovingly, honestly, carefully contemplate, think, and pray, and listen to what God says. So silence is number one. And the second one is equally pressing, I think. The second issue is saturation. I think we live in a very, very saturated culture with regard to sexuality. Let me show you what I mean. 1876, Alexander Graham Bell invents the telephone. There's some debate about exactly if did he invent it or did he just make it better, whatever. First phone call was to his assistant, Thomas Watson, who was in the next room. Anybody know the first line that he says on the phone call? Thomas, or Watson, come here. I want you. Now, I guarantee you, if you go into a middle school group and you just say that, you're going to get Snickers. Or just saying the phrase, it evokes all these, maybe movies, slogans, songs, whatever. Because we live in a very different culture than Alexander Graham Bell did. Our culture is so saturated with sexuality that even simple phrases can be pressed into something very, very different. And nearly every word in our language can be shoehorned to convey the sexual. Today's sermon title is a perfect example. I settled on a title I hate for a sermon: introduction. Who wants to hear an introduction sermon? I want to hear the sermon, not an introduction. I was looking for something else. But because it was a sermon about sexuality, I didn't think teaser would be appropriate. So I crossed that one off my list. And then I put, how about a sneak peek? Didn't seem right. How about a jump start? I'm not going to go there either. And as I'm writing the sermon, I'm struggling to find even a title for it that doesn't evoke imagery that I don't just want to convey through the title. I mean, they have people on staff at newspapers just watching for this stuff. If you ever watched Jay Leno when he was on jaywalking, they would find newspapers who didn't quite catch the double meaning of a headline or a picture juxtaposed next to a separate story about something else, and it's hard in our culture to even speak because it's so saturated that almost everything you say can be added of this layer of sensual meaning that isn't necessarily helpful. And so our culture is saturated, but it's saturated with something we aren't supposed to talk about. So we hear about it indirectly, we hear about it through media, and it's up front in a very, very public way, and yet it's this ironic paradox that it's saturated with something that generally people don't feel comfortable talking about. I mean, if this is an issue you feel comfortable talking about, you're rare, you're unique. I always say that I really like teaching about sex, but I feel kind of like a weirdo saying it because it's such an important issue, but it's also something that's almost like, is there something wrong with a person who wants to talk about it? We live in a culture that's saturated by it, and yet we're not supposed to talk. So the other side of this is sex is often absent from the one place it's created for. In terms of the number one complaint on Google again, this is according to the New York Times. Number one complaint of married couples, they Google sexless marriage. 20,000 plus a day Google searches with that written in the taskbar, search bar. So sex is intended for marriage, but ironically, it tends to be everywhere else. Everywhere else but marriage. So silence, saturation. And the third and final one that we're aiming this series at, that kind of inspires the series, is suppositions. I was going to put presuppositions, but it wouldn't be 3 S's, and we can't have that, so I just put suppositions with a little bit pre, if you want a better, actually more fitting word. The suppositions that we bring to this issue. I have this fundamental belief that when it comes to sexuality, personal experience is God, with a small g. I have had people in past ministry, past churches, I have had people come to my office, and maybe they had a different view, or they heard a teaching from our church and just wanted to kind of share their own. And this isn't an issue that people just change their minds readily about. I mean, there's a huge layer of personal experience here that really shapes our thinking. And I've never yet met a person who sat down, argued about it, and then went home and said, "Oh, okay, I get it. I'll change my mind." Personal experience tends to shape. We tend to come to this issue with our own biases, personal experiences, and values that maybe we caught or were taught or were just raised with, that we embraced because of whatever personal experience we have. And there is very little openness then to wisdom that comes from outside of one's self. That's not a good thing for any of us. If I am closed off to wisdom that comes from beyond myself, I'm never going to be who I could be. I'm going to be stuck reinventing the wheel of personal experience, learning through my own trial and error versus benefiting from the wisdom of thousands of years of history, tradition, science. So the personal experiencing is a challenge because it kind of walls us off from wisdom that can come from people and also Scripture. There's a huge need and I think a huge opportunity for Scripture to shape our suppositions. And that can happen only when we open up to it and say, God, I want Christ to be the leader and forgiver of my life. I want Him to be in the driver's seat. I want Jesus to take the wheel, so to speak. And I want His Word to kind of shape my lifestyle, my decisions, my direction of how I live. And that only happens when Christ is sitting front and center in your life. Otherwise, it's just an old book, and the presupposition is that it's just outdated or worse. I want to end with one of these suppositions. I'm going to invite the band back up, and I'm going to end with one of these suppositions I just kind of want to clear off right away. And you may not agree with me, but at the very least, I just want you to know where I'm coming from, where we're coming from with this. And the supposition is this, that you either affirm or reject someone. This could be related to sexuality or any other, debatable issue or lifestyle decision or whatever. That you can either affirm someone or reject someone. We talk about this a lot. Whether you're talking about cohabitation, premarital sex, serial sex, homosexuality, heterosexuality, this tendency or that tendency, whatever it might be, the assumption in our culture is that either I affirm everything that I see about someone and affirm everyone's decisions, or I can't do that, so I have to get the hate glove out and I have to hate, and I have to reject, and I have to press them into a place where they're understood to be judged. This is really a challenge because this is a ridiculous false choice. It's a ridiculous false choice, and Jesus chooses neither. So here, perfect example. John chapter 8, the wonderful story in Scripture about the woman caught in adultery. She and this man, and in that culture, they were harder on the woman than the man. Shame on them. They shouldn't have been. But in that culture, they were. A man and a woman caught in adultery. They take the woman, they drag her without clothes on, caught in the act, out into the public square. They pick up stones because they could quote a no longer applied but still present a law from the Old Testament that they would stone such offenders, and they stood around here and wanted to trap Jesus. Jesus, affirm or reject. Jesus, do we stone her? Knowing that the Romans, who were in power at the time, said they couldn't issue the death penalty anymore, so they get him in trouble that way. Or they said, do we affirm her? Do we say everything's okay? In which Jesus now throws away everything that they knew about marriage and sexuality from God's Word. Jesus looks at them. He must have just felt disgusted because he knows what they're doing. They're trying to trap him. And remember what he does. Does he choose affirmation? Does he say, you know what? To each his own. Let this woman do what she feels called to do. Let her and this man, they're not hurting anyone else. Let them do what they feel called. He doesn't affirm, but he doesn't reject. He doesn't say, give me a stone, man, I'm with you. He doesn't say it's in the Bible somewhere. I can find and misquote and misapply a verse that was meant for a time and a context that is very different from our own, but I'm going to misapply that and join you with the stone. Let's do it. He doesn't judge either. In fact, he actually judges her accusers. I love it. He turns to them and says, let him of you who is without sin cast a first stone. And then what happens next is priceless. These judgmental, grumpy snobs stand there with their stones in their hand, and it says they drop them one by one and walk away. But it says the older do it first. The ones that were wise enough to recognize maybe Jesus has a point, or were wise enough to maybe see, you know what are we doing? Dropped their stones and walked away first. Jesus chooses neither. He chooses the third way. This series is about the third way. Three Lies About Sex is not going to be a series where we affirm everything and anything, relativity 101. It's not going to be a series where we reject and we judge. We put ourselves in God's judgment seat and categorize people and judge them and send them halfway to hell even before they die. It's a series where we choose the third way that Jesus chose, where we recognize that this church is named after that third way, the surprise party that God threw for the prodigal son when he came home, broken, sinful. Didn't affirm him, didn't reject him, welcomed him home, and step by step showed him once again what it was like to be a member of the family. This series is about the third way. So we're going to take one lie a week for 3 weeks, 3 lies in 3 weeks. We're going to ask God to reshape our suppositions so that we can bring grace and truth into a culture that is saturated and silent. Let's pray. Jesus, may you have your way with us. I imagine that every single one of us in this room needs presuppositions reshaped by the Word of God. That we have adopted either an affirming or a judgmental mindset that is not the third way of Jesus. That is not the way of grace and truth. That is not the way to bring love into a culture that is shallow when it comes to love. That is not the way to bring truth into a culture that believes that truth is relative. God, make us the most loving people in this city, the most humble people in this city. Make your followers equipped to walk into a culture saturated and silent with the life-changing hope of a God who would rather die than be without us. Let's stand.